Our special guest today is Kimberly Emery. Kimberly is a licensed marriage and family therapist, as well as a licensed addiction counselor. Kimberly has also specialized in treating young adults, navigating the dating world, dealing with heartbreak and loneliness, and preparing for marriage. Kimberly's presentation today is called Love and Hurt: Practical Ways to Create Healthy Relationships After Trauma. Kimberly will be teaching practical strategies to become more aware of and cope with trauma wounds or a trauma history, and how these strategies can help you create a healthy, safe relationship with your partner. There will be an anonymous Q&A session for the last 15 minutes with Kimberly. Your questions, they can be anonymous or not, up to you. But please don't use the chat box throughout the presentation. Save your questions for the Q&A portion. And if you think of any questions during the presentation, go ahead and write them down and save them for later so you don't forget. This webinar is approved for 1 continuing education credit. So if you are looking to get a certificate for attending this webinar, you can email me at marriagecommission@usu.edu and request a certificate from me signed by Kimberly. All right. Thank you so much, Kimberly, for being willing to present to us today and sharing your wealth of knowledge on trauma and relationships. We're really excited to hear from you.
Thank you. I'm very excited to share this information. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Like Camilla mentioned, I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist and addiction counselor. I've been in practice for almost a decade, and over the last few years have started to specialize in treating trauma and working with couples who have had experience of trauma in their personal lives, which are impacting their relationships. So our goal today is twofold: to give some education about trauma and how that impacts relationships and what that can look like, and then start to talk about some practical skills that can be implemented into your lives and your relationships to at least start to manage some of those responses. This presentation does not take the place of therapy. I will at some point be recommending therapy for anyone who has been through something traumatic and is finding that it is interfering in their relationships. But I know that's not an option for everyone. And starting with just some basic education and understanding can be so powerful when you're going through something that makes you feel really alone and crazy. And as a heads up, I can see that our rescue German Shepherd is looking around. So if he makes an appearance, he might just pop his nose in. I'm an animal assisted therapist as well, and Jackson has his own trauma history that we've been able to start to do some healing with through our relationship. So if he comes and says hello, that's just because he loves to see his people. So I wanted to start with a basic introduction of what is trauma, because it's a word that gets thrown around, and a lot of people sometimes minimize what they've been through because they don't understand what trauma is. Other times people think that their trauma is worse than everybody else's, and so nobody else's experiences matter. But trauma is basically a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. When we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, we start to get pretty specific about some of the symptoms and experiences that people might find that they've had. But truly, trauma is subjective. Your experience of something that is traumatic for you may or may not feel traumatic for somebody else. And it's important to really understand that trauma does not have to fit into these boxes of life-changing car accident or severe persistent trauma in relationship. Trauma is anything that is deeply distressing or disturbing. Another way I like to think about it is it's something your brain wasn't prepared for. The image I like to use when talking about how the brain processes trauma is the image of cleaning your room. If you have a mess all over your room, there's toys out, there's books out, there's underwear on the floor, and your mom comes in the room and says, you know, when I come back in 8 hours, I'd like to see this room cleaned. You know what to expect. You have a framework of where things go, how they fit into your world. So you're going to put your socks in your sock drawer. You're going to hang your sweaters up on a hanger and put them in the closet. You're going to put your books on the bookshelf and any toys in whatever toy chest they're supposed to be in. And then when mom comes home in 8 hours, your room is not only clean, but you know where things are and you know what to expect. When you have trauma, the flip side of that is the idea that mom comes in and says, you have 5 minutes to clean up this mess, and if you don't, you're grounded. You're never leaving your room again. I'm taking away your cell phone, whatever the punishment is. And so in experiences like that, we just start shoving things under the mattress and putting the socks in the underwear drawer, and nothing gets hung up on the hangers. And so mom might come back and take a look and say, okay, you're safe for now. But when you go to bed at night and you throw up your covers, you're going to find things under there that you weren't expecting, and it might be jarring. Trauma is basically the experience of our brain not being able to process and taking things that have hurt us and putting them in a place where we really can't understand it. So trauma does not have to be life or death. Your trauma cannot objectively be compared to somebody else's, because everybody's trauma is different. Their lived experiences, no matter how similar, are still different. And it can be the result of a one-time experience, a prolonged or repeated exposure to a disturbing or distressing experience, or, oops, I've cut off my slide a little bit, multiple disturbing experiences over a lifetime. I'm going to try to make my screen just a little bit bigger to see if that helps. And thank you for bearing with me, because Zoom is not always the modality I present in. So trauma impacts our relationships. No matter how we cut it, it gets into our relationships and can cause difficulties, distress, disconnect. So I've done a little bit of research on some of the common experiences in relationships with trauma. Couples where one or both partners have had childhood abuse or trauma have been shown to report a higher individual stress level, lower marital satisfaction, and lower family cohesion. Betrayal traumas, such as abuse committed by a trusted person, that could be intimate partner violence, that can be abuse from a family member, abuse by somebody that you love, somebody that you trusted, that often leads to the expectation that every relationship will eventually include violence. Survivors reported their lower self-esteem, sabotaged relationships, led to poor communication skills, and created fears of being vulnerable and victimized in relationships. So part of why that is because our brains are designed to make sense of the world based on what we've experienced and what we've known. Jackson, he's sleeping over here, so you can't see him right now. Our German Shepherd came to our family incredibly traumatized. And so he projected on us the things that he knew about the world, which means that for the first about a week that he was with our family, he didn't even leave the front door of the house, because he didn't know that he could trust us, because people have hurt him before. So we cannot understand the world outside of a context that we haven't actually had exposure to. So if your relationships have included trauma, it's almost impossible to envision a relationship where it is safe to be vulnerable and we can communicate without fear. Survivors of trauma in relationships can manifest in behaviors and attitudes that are counterproductive to creating and sustaining healthy relationships. We often start to replay some of the dynamics in previous relationships, or act in ways that don't advocate for our needs because we don't know how to, and it's never been safe. So you may have some understanding of this. This is, again, back to some of the Trauma 101, but there are three main parts of the brain that are affected by our trauma. Our hippocampus has reduced activity when we have experienced traumatic events. So it can't tell the difference between a traumatic event and the memory of it. Our amygdala goes into overdrive and begins to react as if trauma is happening all over again. Our prefrontal cortex becomes suppressed, which decreases our ability to control fear and gets us stuck in a reactive state, which means the traumatized brain is more reactive, the past becomes present to it, and we become hypervigilant. Another thing that happens that a lot of people are not aware of, this is called the fiery cocktail or the chemical dump. This is a cocktail of multiple, I didn't write it down this time, so it's like at least cortisol and adrenaline when we start to get triggered and go into fight or flight. Oh, I'm getting a message my connection is unstable, so I'm just going to repeat that one more time in case you missed it. The fiery cocktail is the release of dozens of chemicals and hormones into our bloodstreams, including adrenaline and cortisol, which when we go into fight or flight, they put our body into a state where we are just reacting to whatever we perceive to be happening now. And it can take upwards of 36 hours to metabolize that chemical dump. So we actually become more likely to be triggered over and over again. And a lot of people don't know that. So their experiences with being reactive and afraid and triggered more and more often make them feel like they're crazy and that they don't live in the reality that everybody else is experiencing. But the truth is, the body is just reacting to the reality that it has experienced before and that it knows to be true. It hasn't had enough evidence or enough time to feel safe to be safe. So something that happens in relationships when there's a history of trauma is what we like to call the pendulum. And if you've seen a pendulum swing back and forth, it's basically an image from going from one extreme to the other. So you'll see this in survivors of abusive situations where they've been victimized for so long, they overcorrect in relationship and sometimes become the abuser. The perspective shifts from nobody's ever going to hurt me again, so I'm going to protect myself by being the aggressor. And it can show up in other places, but what we found is that in relationships, we can have these big swings that start to make us feel unstable and make it hard to have a steady connection with our partner. So oftentimes survivors of trauma might report that they don't feel like they're consistent in how they're experiencing their relationship, or they become a person they really don't want to be. And that's because we're trying to correct to find a place of safety. And oftentimes that means we're swinging back and forth, overcorrecting, then going back to a place where we have to cower. And that's a very common experience. And so I just want to share that for the sake of normalizing it if it's an experience you might be having in your relationship. So knowing some of that information about what your brain is doing, what your body is doing, how it might be showing up in your relationships, and what problems it might be causing, the question is, what do I actually do about it? And so the first thing is just gaining that knowledge and letting that knowledge sit with you and become real for you. Because what the knowledge does is starts to illuminate your experience of the world and help you to understand yourself and understand that this isn't because you're crazy. This isn't because something is wrong with you. Your brain and body have adapted to the world to keep you safe. And that is such a powerful thing to know that your brain and body are doing exactly what they needed to do to ensure your safety. The problem is they're lagging behind now. And if it's safe now, they don't know. They haven't been able to catch up. So we're here to help catch them up with some of this information. Knowledge alone does not change the way the brain functions, but it's valuable in starting to understand yourself and identifying your personal trauma responses. As much as I can talk about some of the typical ways or the ways that research has shown us that people with trauma might respond in relationship, your lived experience is going to be different day to day than another person's. So starting to understand your triggers and your responses is very helpful in starting to see where the shifts need to start to take place. This knowledge isn't just powerful for survivors of trauma, but it's incredibly powerful for partners who love somebody with trauma. Because again, sometimes the partners in relationships feel crazy or out of control, not really knowing what is happening in their relationship. So sharing this information with the people you love, as scary as that can be, gives them insight and helps them learn and utilize skills to intervene in that moment. How can they create safety in that moment? What do you need from them in that moment? And those are all conversations that we'll talk about having one-on-one with your partners. Knowledge is also destigmatizing and normalizing. It validates your experience. It lets you know you're not alone. There's an assessment that clinicians do when we do a process called EMDR. It's a really common trauma therapy. When I did the training, I was told it's the only one that the VA likes to use. That's probably not true, but it's one of their selling points. Before we ever do those trauma therapies, we do an assessment for dissociation on our clients to see how connected are they to their body, how much are they recognizing in their lived experiences, where's their memory at. All of those things can be affected by trauma. And I had a client do it recently, and her response to it was, reading these questions makes me know I'm not the only one. I'm not alone, because enough people feel this way that they've put it on a questionnaire. So knowledge is power in the sense that it's validating, it universalizes the experience, and it helps you to start to identify what's unique about my experience. Where do I have some power here? So some continued reading, if you are somebody who has trauma or somebody you love has trauma, is The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. This is hands down probably the most recommended book on trauma for survivors. Every trauma therapist should read it. Every client who is receiving trauma treatment would benefit from reading it. Another book is Greater Than the Sum of Our Parts by Dr. Dick Schwartz, and he was the founder of internal family systems. Internal family systems is another modality of therapy that we use in trauma treatment. And Greater Than the Sum of Our Parts gives you practical skills and meditations to start to understand your world a little better. So I highly recommend it. Getting the audiobook is wonderful because you can listen to it, and as he reads through a meditation to help you understand a part of yourself, you can just go with it. So there are a few therapies that are recommended for trauma treatment. Some of them can actually be done with couples. Internal family systems has a couples modality. I believe EMDR has a couples modality. I think brain spotting can be done in groups. But so there are particular modalities of therapy that you might want to look into if you or your partner are struggling with trauma. EMDR uses eye movement or other types of bilateral stimulation to help you process trauma. Brain spotting is another focused mindfulness that uses eye movement to help you process your trauma. Somatic experiencing is another body-based modality. And internal family systems, to me, feels very different and might be my favorite one, but I'm biased because I'm learning it right now. So some practical skills and tips for starting to improve your relationship when you are struggling with trauma is to first move at your own pace. My experience of working with couples in trauma is that there's a huge spectrum of how quickly people feel pressured to move, whether that's by their partners or by something internally or by a sense of what society expects of them. Some people want to rush through, get into the relationship, find the safety. Other people feel like they're paralyzed and can't move. They can't start dating. They can't be involved in any relationships, or they can't move and progress through relationship out of fear. And what we want to do is really honor what you need in that moment. Again, it takes starting to get to know yourself, knowing what some of your trauma responses are, knowing how it's showing up in your relationship. But when you can see my fear in moving forward is about this trauma. I'm afraid that if I take the next step, this person's going to be just like my former abuser, whatever the thought process is. When we can start to identify it, we can see, how is that affecting the pace of your relationship? Are you somebody who feels like, I just need to get to the finish line to get through this? Or the person who can't quite get off the racing blocks because it's just too scary, or anywhere in between. So when discerning how ready you are in a new relationship or moving to the next step of a relationship, honor that voice in your head that's asking you about the pace, that's telling you to stop, that's telling you to rush. My favorite thing to do with that voice is to ask it what it wants you to know. To take a deep breath, figure out where you feel it in your body. Turn your focus inward. Do you feel it in your stomach, in your chest? Is it a numbness? Is it a tingling? And just be with it for a minute and ask it what it wants you to know. And let yourself listen to it and see, oftentimes that voice has some value. Start to figure out your limitations in relationship. What are the things that are super scary to you? Name them, identify them, and start to explore them a little bit. If it's really, really scary to be committed to somebody, what would you actually need to feel safe there? What are things that you would need your partner to demonstrate to you in order for you to take that step? If we can find that answer, we can actually start to explore that in the context of relationship and then see, is that something that my partner can do for me? Or is my expectation when I say it out loud something that nobody could actually do for me? And so maybe that expectation needs to shift a little bit. Moving at your own pace and exploring that pace with potential partners may help to identify potential barriers to feeling safe and secure in relationship. And one of the hardest parts for people can actually be having that conversation in relationships because it's incredibly vulnerable and it gives somebody power to know a bit about your story. We need to take care of ourselves first in relationships. The most fascinating thing to me as a marriage therapist about relationships is the fact that we are taking two people from different worlds with different lived experiences, potentially different values, families of origin, maybe from different cultures, and we're putting them together and expecting them to just meld. And oftentimes people with trauma can struggle with, how do I prioritize my needs, or do I just need to focus on my partner? Do I even have a voice in this relationship? And it's a cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason. If you do not put your oxygen mask on first, you cannot help anybody else. If you are on the airplane and the air pressure drops, you can't go put somebody else's mask on because you'll pass out on the way. And then you're no help to anybody. So starting to actually explore your needs and honor them outside of your relationship is a really powerful step to engaging in a healthier relationship. This might look like exploring new avenues of self-care, which is another topic that's really hot right now, and everybody's got their own definition and ideas, but truly figuring out what feeds you, what makes you feel safe, what makes you feel calm, what helps your emotions to stay regulated. Start to explore different ways to do that in your own personal world before bringing them into relationship, and honoring your needs in the relationship. Again, another scary concept. If I honor my needs, does that mean this person's going to hurt me? Are they going to abandon me? Are they going to humiliate me for saying that I have a need? Are they going to mock my needs and make me feel like they're not important? These things are easier said than done, but starting to say them even look like to try it. And I'm getting another message that my internet was unstable, so I'm just going to repeat that point. All of these points that we're going to be making happen in increments and baby steps. We don't just jump into the deep end and say, I'm going to, start running marathons and take a bath every night and give up drinking and do 10 things to take care of myself so that I can move past my trauma and be healthy in relationships. That's not how it works, and that sets us up for failure. Starting to identify and honor your needs is an incremental baby step process. So all of these pieces just move bit by bit, and at a certain point, you've made some progress. So letting your partner in, that was something I mentioned a few slides ago, and can be one of the worst parts about dealing with relationships and trauma. Some people feel the pressure to let a partner in right away and just get everything out so that it doesn't feel like they're hiding any secrets. Some people feel like it's never safe to tell. And the truth is, letting your partner in is a very particular process for each person. It cannot be the same across the board for one survivor to the next. And this is where moving at your pace starts to come in. And building some insight and awareness is going to help you ask yourself the right questions to know, does this pace feel appropriate for where we're at right now, or is it just a safety net? So as it feels safe, as you get to know somebody, it's appropriate to start to share more about your story. A common mistake is putting everything on the table before you know very much about your partner. And partnerships should be a little bit more equal in how we're sharing and how we're getting to know each other. For survivors of trauma, that can be important because of the power dynamics. If you've been in a role, other times it feels like I have to let somebody know this because they can't love me if they don't know this. And the in between is letting your partner be vulnerable too, and seeing how it feels to even receive that vulnerability. You're allowed to wait to disclose how you've been hurt and to share that story in increments. Sharing your trauma story with your partner can be helpful for giving them a sense of knowing some of your triggers, thinking about what you've been through and being sensitive to that, working with you in things that don't feel safe. But we don't have to let everything out all at once if that doesn't feel appropriate to you. And one of the things I feel really strongly about as a marriage therapist and a trauma therapist is starting to trust your gut, which feels counterintuitive when your body and your brain have been giving you panic and crisis messages for so long. But from my perspective in trauma work, a major part is helping survivors hone and understand and trust their gut again. And these are places where you get to play with that in relationship and see how it feels. Something I've also learned is that in the right relationship, if it's hard to really let go and your partner has to create a safer space for you and you can ask for that, or if you feel like you've let out too much, but your partner's really kind and safe in responding to it, we can come back from that. Your body is going to tell you it's a catastrophe, but again, that knowledge piece of knowing in the right relationship with a safe partner, I can make mistakes is really important. And the flip side of that is that we need our partners to demonstrate that they are safe. Something that tends to happen and is a very real fear for survivors of trauma is the idea that these dynamics will replay over and over again. And there's some truth to that we tend to end up in similar situations and in places that replay our trauma with new perpetrators. That's terrifying. And so letting our partners demonstrate what makes them safe, how are they trustworthy? It might not be 100% of the time. The scary thing about life is that we can be wrong again. But if we never take the chance, we won't actually know. So trying to figure out what makes my partner safe to start to hold space for this story and seeing if you can suss that out and feel that in your relationship, then let you test that and get some affirmation and feedback that you can now take to your lived experience and say, as much as I knew a world of trauma and abuse, I also know a world where one person can be safe. And that helps us build knowledge in another way. Knowledge that not everything in our world is going to replay that trauma. Not everywhere is unsafe. This helps us to build knowledge that there are actually people in the world who can love us for who we are, who won't punish us for the things that for our feelings or for things that we do wrong, who are going to walk the journey with us. And that's incredibly powerful knowledge. Honestly, I think that's the thing about therapy that changes people, that helps them heal, is relationship and feeling safe with someone who can hold space for their pain. That's why therapy works. That's why relationships can be an incredibly powerful healing experience for trauma survivors. But there's a lot of barriers to letting people in, and they're valid. Anyone who says they're not valid is kidding themselves. Rebuilding and strengthening your self-worth goes back to putting on your oxygen mask, starting to build insight and awareness about yourself, starting to understand and recognize the wonderful person you are and the gifts that you have is another really important part of starting to heal from trauma and bringing that healing into your relationship. An interesting piece about that is healthy relationships often increase that sense of self-esteem and self-worth. But that journey starts with you. We can't wait for relationships to do that for us, even though the right relationships often help facilitate that process. This includes the insight I talked about, recognizing your wants, your needs, and what you deserve in a relationship. Experiences of abuse and trauma can so often teach us that we are not worth having somebody who cares, not worth having somebody who sacrifices for us, not worth somebody who prioritizes your needs over theirs once in a while. And we want to try to find ways to reinforce that narrative. Again, that happens in relationship with the right people. But where else is the world potentially telling you that you can have what you want, that your needs matter, that you actually do deserve good things? You might have to look out into your community, into your workplace, into potentially friendships that you have. One that might sound silly, but again, as an animal assisted therapist and as somebody who just uses my own dog for coping, our animal relationships. This is why something that I think therapists can feel is a little bit, what's the word I'm looking for? Therapists sometimes have strong opinions about emotional support animals. I'm somebody who I actually really believe in them. I think there's very much something that happens, and research would back this up, from the release of oxytocin to the sense of companionship. Having a pet who needs you, who sees that even in all your flaws, you're still the apple of their eye, can be incredibly powerful in realizing that you deserve good relationships and that you might actually be worth somebody loving you. So recognizing what you want and need and starting to find evidence that you actually deserve to have those needs met is a practical step in finding some healing from trauma and bringing it into your relationship. Because when you find it outside in the world, what makes your relationship that different? Why wouldn't your partner want to meet your needs or honor your needs or make space for your priorities when you realize that they have value? Learning and utilizing grounding skills. This is probably the most important practical skill for starting to heal from trauma and bringing that healing into your relationship and having a healthy relationship. One of the biggest pitfalls I have seen doing couples therapy with clients who have trauma is the level of bodily dysregulation and emotional dysregulation when things start to get hard or conflict arises completely derails the relationship. That's when we start to get emotional or our fight or flight response kicks in. That prefrontal cortex that's responsible for forward thinking and making our good decisions fizzles out. We go right back to feeling like the trauma is real again, and our partners become the perpetrators, even if they're not. Which, again, something I feel like I have to say is there are relationships that aren't safe. And you might find that you have trauma and you're in a relationship that's not safe. And in that case, starting to identify that is going to be really important for navigating out of that relationship and reassessing and figuring out where you are. That being said, in relationships where that trauma is getting in the way, it so frequently happens in moments of bodily and emotional dysregulation. And one of the quickest, easiest ways to start to reestablish that regulation is grounding and mindfulness. So, mindfulness is really just the practice of being present to what's happening right now without judgment. Grounding is getting back into that reality, getting in touch with what's happening around you, letting it start to feel real again. Because trauma gets us back in the past, our body starts to relive what's happening, even if it's not flashbacks or a belief that it's happening all over again. Our body is responding like it's happening all over again. So, being able to calmly ground, you can do a Google search and find 20 mindfulness skills, lists of 100 mindfulness or grounding skills. Very common ones are box breathing, which is basically breathing in the rhythm of a square. Breathe in for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, breathe out for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, breathe in again, and just keep going with that pattern. It's actually Navy SEALs are apparently trained in this, but it brings us back into our body, into our space. Very common one, the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 technique. What are 5 things you see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. Body scans. Okay, what do I feel in my toes? What's under my feet? All right, I feel my slippers. I feel the carpet. What do I feel in my calves? What's happening in my body? Starting to connect with your reality around you. Grounding skills and mindfulness practices can be very helpful in reducing conflict, that escalation in relationship that survivors of trauma often experience. Mindfulness is a great practice to engage in regularly. To start your morning with a 5-minute mindfulness meditation. For me, it was this summer drinking my coffee on the porch, 5 or 10 minutes, feeling the concrete under me, feeling the warmth of the cup of the coffee in my hand, being present to the taste of it, just for 5 or 10 minutes. But 20 minutes of mindfulness practices a day can actually help change what's happening in your brain. So, making that a regular practice as an individual and as a couple. I often recommend to my couples that they engage in mindfulness techniques together. Make it a practice to hold each other accountable, to experience it together and bring that sense of a shared experience or shared meaning can be really powerful. These skills increase awareness in moments of conflict and help individuals tune back into what's real and happening in the moment. And that's incredibly powerful for trauma survivors because so often we're pulled back into what happened, not what's happening now. Building a relationship with the voice in your head. I find this to be a really important part of starting to understand yourself and navigate your relationship with trauma. Survivors of trauma must learn to recognize and reconcile the inconsistencies of what their past experiences tell them will happen and what is actually happening in relationships. So that means we have to listen, not just listen to the voice in our head, but really get to know it. What does it tell you? Why is it trying to tell you that? What experiences have taught that voice to think that way? And as you live your experience right now, does it feel like that voice is correct? Sometimes it is. And I think it's really important to recognize that that voice can be right. But if it's not, what do we do next? This process is complicated by relationships that mimic and recreate traumatic experiences. So the more chaotic relationships that you've been in, they're going to reinforce that belief for us. That voice is going to get stronger and it's going to have more evidence for what it believes about the world. And so that's just another reason I caution to make blanket statements like, hey, you've survived your trauma, you're now in a healthy relationship, might not be true. And so we're going back to those basics of just starting to touch in and see what tells me these relationships aren't safe. If this voice is onto something, I want to be able to honor it. But if this voice is telling me something about my partner, and I've just got a lot of evidence that my partner is not like that, then we need to start gently challenging that voice. And my experience has taught me that we do not challenge or bully that voice. I think about teenagers and their parents, and sometimes the communication that happens there. I was the obstinate teenager who knew way better than my parents. So if they tried to, gently tell me that I was wrong about something, it was the end of the world. And I just had to put them in their place. We don't want to treat the voice like that. And it might try to treat us like that. But what we're finding is we want to be the grown-up in the room with this voice. And grown-ups, hopefully, honor the story that we're telling, honor our needs, know that we're coming from a place of good, and try to work with us, even if it feels like we're wrong or we're hurting. So sometimes we have to think of the voice in our head like a hurt teenager or a hurt child. And many times that voice is there because there was a part of you that was a hurt child or a hurt teenager, and people didn't validate its experience. This idea comes from that process of internal family systems, which is what I think is just a very, very human way of understanding that. When we stop othering the voice in our head, when we stop making it the scapegoat or making it wrong or crazy, we actually give it space to start to explore the nuances of what's happening. Communication is key in relationships and often a struggle when we have past traumas that are affecting our relationships. Talking to partners about the impact of a survivor's trauma on the relationship and teaching them how to offer support is a very key component of helping our relationships to thrive and be healthier when we have trauma symptoms that are interfering. And it goes back to that idea of how hard it can be to tell your partner about what's happened in your world. It doesn't always feel safe to let your partner know how to help you and teach them how to offer support. In some situations, it's appropriate to ask a partner to go to therapy and start to learn about it from somebody else. Talk to them about how somebody else's trauma is impacting my relationship. What do I need to know now? What do I need to do differently? How do I support my partner? That's psychoeducation that somebody can receive somewhere. But when you learn and understand your personal patterns of communication or your personal patterns that inhibit your ability to communicate, you can work on yourself there and you can bring them to the table with your partner to talk about them. If there's a barrier to effectively communicating, when you tell your partner, you can both work on that barrier together rather than you fighting that battle alone. So this is where really starting to have these conversations with our partners can be so crucial once it feels safe and once they've demonstrated that they're safe people. Cultivating community is another really important part of navigating our trauma and reducing its impact on relationships. There's so much that a community can do for us in starting to do a few of the things that we talked about. Recognizing what's real in the world versus what our trauma might be telling us is real that's not. Is our partner safe or not? When we have people in the community we can share these stories with safely, that we can learn from, that we can invite into our worlds, they can give us the information that we need to start to understand our world a little bit better. An example of this is oftentimes I'll hear stories about somebody who has a partner, and when they go into it, they've got tunnel vision because they love this person and they're great. And everybody in their world is seeing the red flags, but I can't see them for myself because all I see is how wonderful this person is. Having community and people in our world that we can trust their judgment can really help us start to understand our relationships better. If you're feeling fear and everybody in your world is saying, yep, red flags, get out of there, you now know it's not just you. It's not just your trauma. Your gut was telling you something and the people around you saw it. But you might also talk to your friends or people in your community who you trust about experiences where, when they're honest, they might tell you, hey, I think what you're experiencing might not be because this person's an unsafe person. It sounds like your trauma might be, your past experiences might be influencing how you're perceiving things right now. So we get a lot of things from our communities. We get that outside perspective that can help us put things in an appropriate place. We also get validation and universality. Trauma is something that a lot of people carry. Um, Statistically, I think more people probably have traumatic experiences in their past than not. Experiences of sexual abuse, domestic violence, family violence are far more common than we know. And so starting to connect with other people in your world who feel safe, whether that's through some kind of values-based organization, a volunteer organization, a faith-based organization, starting to meet people who share your worldview, who share passions that you have, just starting to connect on different levels and building intimate relationships with people non-romantically help us to build deeper relationships with people who can become some of our safe people. And then at that point, you probably find that they've been through similar things. Most of the clients I have who have trauma have friends and family who have trauma too. And so when we start to connect with those people, whether maybe in group therapy or maybe in support groups that aren't therapeutic in nature, they're just a place to process, groups that you have found through victim advocacy organizations. In Colorado, there's one called the Blue Bench. That's a common referral when somebody's been through something traumatic. You might find that these groups connect you to people who have shared experiences. They teach you ways that they've gotten through their traumatic experiences or how they're mitigating the impact on their relationships. There's a lot of value in cultivating community. It also gives us safe places to process and help one another. I think another really powerful thing for survivors of trauma is knowing that they can help other people, and living and feeling that experience in community relationships and friendships gives us space to actually practice that in our romantic relationships. Because again, going back to that lack of self-worth, that feeling that we just can't do anything, bringing that into our relationships, oftentimes that causes its own dynamic where I'm just helpless and I can't do anything for my partner. And learning how to help other people in your community can be really powerful. So there's a number of reasons to start cultivating outside community, outside of romantic relationships, outside of family, that can be very powerful in navigating healing from trauma and starting to shift what's happening in your own relationship. The last thing before we start our Q&A that I want to mention is addressing substance use. Exposure to trauma, especially in childhood, has been linked to substance abuse disorders. Substance abuse disorders are highly comorbid with PTSD, which means they often come hand in hand. Up to 59% of young people with PTSD develop a substance abuse disorder. Substances are often used to self-medicate to try to manage mood fluctuations and other trauma symptoms. And they also 9 times out of 10, or I'm going to say 10 times out of 10, exacerbate issues in relationships. Adding to that, about 80% of people at some point in their life will meet the criteria for a substance use disorder. So that's definitely more of a risk for somebody who has trauma. And if we are using alcohol or any kind of other substances in our relationships, when conflict starts, when it feels unsafe, when you go into fight or flight, substances always make it worse. So I encourage, and I assess in my work with trauma survivors, I assess substance use. I ask the questions about it. I look for indicators. And if there's substance use happening that's problematic, that's an area of growth that is always going to add some element of improvement in relationships. And I feel like I have to say it because so many of us actually don't recognize that our substance use is problematic. So that's not to say that everyone who has trauma has an issue with substance use, but if you're experiencing difficulties in your relationship and you do drink or use marijuana or use any other substance, it's worth checking in with how often you're using and what that use looks like. And as my father used to say, nothing bad ever happened for having a salad. So sobriety just has its benefits. So here's just a list of a few references that I used to put this presentation together, which I know it's kind of small. And so hopefully you can take a peek, take a screenshot or a photo if you want to try to hunt down some of those articles to read for yourself. Reference those books that I mentioned up top. oh my gosh, the body keeps the score. And I always misquote Schwartz's book, but Greater Than the Sum of Our Parts. Great resources. And then we're going to shift to our Q&A for the next 10 or 15 minutes. And I want to make sure I say, do not forget to fill out the survey. So I had to make myself that reminder. And I'm going to peek at the Q&A. I see we have a couple questions. So the first one I'm going to answer live is, do you recommend DBT as more effective than EMDR? That's a super interesting question. DBT is a really beneficial modality. I think as far as recommending one modality more than another, it would really be about what works for the survivor and what works for the clinician. So a clinician who hates doing EMDR and does a crummy job of it isn't going to do it well. And if they're really skilled in DBT, that would probably be the modality they want to use because they're going to be better at it. By the same token, I've had clients who we start EMDR and it absolutely does not work for them. And that's where having other skills in my pocket. For some of those clients, IFS was a way better choice. It just fit who they were better. It fit their language better. Or brain spotting just seemed to be less, the shift in structure was better for them. So as far as one modality over the other, it's really about, first and foremost, about the client, what the client responds to. I couldn't make a recommendation either way. They're both great approaches, and DBT is a wonderful approach for working with clients who have what's called borderline personality disorder, which is, at the end of the day, is just a trauma response. It's absolutely a trauma response, and there's nothing wrong with you for having it. So if a client has been diagnosed with borderline personality, DBT is a really great method for that. But I wouldn't say one over the other. I think it's about the right fit for the client. Let's see. Do you recommend, I'm going to answer this one live. Do you recommend couples therapy as the best way to educate your spouse about trauma and the brain? I think it's a good way to share that information. So if you're currently working with a therapist, bringing your partner in, maybe I wouldn't consider that, like the billing code might be couples counseling, or there's just an add-on code for that. Like this is a psychotherapy session and there's a partner present. That's a great way to educate a spouse or a partner about what's happening. The risk is bringing somebody into your safe space who might be struggling with that. That might change the dynamic a little bit, and that can be kind of challenging in the moment. So it's great if you have your partner's buy-in, and if your therapist feels like they can manage that. If it's a therapist who doesn't work with couples and doesn't like to have more than one person in the room, that might be a struggle, but it is absolutely one option. Another one is offering some kind of reading to your partner, finding videos that explain trauma in the brain or trauma responses to your partner. Some of that honestly depends on your partner's buy-in. And if your partner's really excited about supporting you, I actually think bringing them into that space is a great way to do it. Let's see. Oh, one is, can I share this in a PDF? And I think that would be up to Camilla. I'd be super happy to share this PowerPoint for what it is, just as a file or in some kind of PDF form. So we'll check into that.
I'll just chime in on that really quick. Yeah, if Kimberly, if you send me it, I will make sure that everyone who signed up for this webinar gets a PDF of this. So cool. That sounds great.
Great.
So, yeah.
Cool. How do you identify therapists that use these trauma modalities? One of the easiest ways is if you're using a search engine like Psychology Today, you can specifically use it as a filter. So I'm looking for a therapist in this zip code and click EMDR or brain spotting or internal family systems or DBT or CBT, whatever the modality is that you want. You can filter through different search engines like that. If you're going through insurance, look at people's profiles and see what they're doing. If there's a therapist you really click with, reach out to them and ask for a consultation and ask them to be very explicit about how do they work with trauma. A good trauma therapist can tell you about their approach in detail. All right, can you give examples of bodily and emotional dysregulation? I'm not familiar with those terms. All right, and you're welcome. I hope this has been helpful for people. So a few examples of that bodily dysregulation. We're looking at signs and symptoms that your body is going into fight or flight. So rapid heartbeat, feeling flushed in the face, thoughts racing, feeling your pulse quicken, running out of breath. I know that's one for me when I get bodily dysregulated and emotionally too. I talk a mile a minute. I can't catch my breath. You might feel hot. You might feel numb. So paying attention to your body's response and what feels different from its baseline. When I'm calm, cool, and collected, how does my body feel? And when I start to get upset, what is changing in it? Those will be signs of like bodily dysregulation. We're looking for signs of fight or flight. And you could also probably Google a list of just the ways that our body responds in fight or flight, and it'll give you a good idea to start to check in with your body. Emotional dysregulation, they're basically that you don't get one without the other. Our emotions start in our body. But so again, the emotional regulation, waves of big emotion, feeling like I can't handle that emotion, seeing red, not being able to hear your partner. Those are some examples of that emotional dysregulation. It feels like this feeling is never going to pass, or I can't handle it, it's too big, or it's all I'll ever feel again. Those are some examples. This is an interesting one. What do you think about ketamine treatments for trauma? I think this is a really new and interesting modality, and it's been really hit or miss for some of my clients. I practice in Colorado, so there are ketamine facilities available. I've had some clients who, at least for their depression, the depressive part of it, have found some benefit, and some who feel like it was a total waste of money. This is one to keep your eye on to see how it's looking, because I know there've been some promising studies, but all of this is so personal that it's really hard to say. And at least in my experience with trauma, it seems like it could be an option, but it's so new. And so we really don't know. And I think there's a lot, my addiction counselor self wants to talk a lot about different psychoactive substances and the potential pros and cons, because I think for every pro, there's a lot of cons in a lot of the ways that we turn to external ways to regulate emotion. So looking at ketamine treatments or any kind of other substance that we turn to for mood regulation. Yeah, I think it's something to talk to your provider about if it's an option, and see what they say. You want to talk to somebody who really specializes in it, and also try to find somebody who doesn't have a bias because it's complicated, but definitely not an option. Let's see. How is EMDR effective when the primary mode seems to be holding 2 pulsing electrodes and not being asked questions? It felt like therapy with feel pulses. Okay, so the process of EMDR, and just kind of in a quick nutshell, the idea is that we're doing bilateral stimulation for 2 purposes. It keeps us grounded in the moment, because in EMDR, we're straddling the past and the present. We're going back to the past to process it while being safe in the present. So something like the buzzers in your hands keep us grounded in the moment and present to the moment. Another theory is that the bilateral stimulation helps cross the corpus callosum in our brain. So that's another piece of the processing that we've theorized works with EMDR. Now, there is no asking questions during the processing, but there should be a check-in pretty consistently with, let's go back to the original image, wherever you started, whatever the prompt was for the day, the target you were working with, the negative thoughts associated with that experience and image. We want to ask, what are you noticing now? So I guess there is some question. It's not just sitting there and thinking it shouldn't be. Every time we're going back, what are you noticing now? When you go back to that image, what are you noticing now? Once you've processed that image for about 30 seconds, what are you noticing now? What's changing? So we're keeping you in that moment, letting you process it and experience it. And it is guided by your therapist. So I hope that helps. Do you have any advice for dealing with broken trust committed by my partner while still trying to heal from childhood trauma? That's a really tricky one. And I think very personal for your experience and what's happening for you. identifying it, talking about it, getting a sense of how much my partner is willing to work with me on it, being able to communicate why it hurts and does that matter to my partner would be my thoughts. At the end of the day, if it's a chronic problem and it keeps coming up, the options are couples therapy. There's workshops from like the Gottmans. The Gottman method is a common marriage approach. So there's some workshops you could do if it's a common problem, but if it's a one-off, that this was a big deal, that my trust was broken, and my partner knows I'm still trying to do this healing, addressing it and having some repair. Relationships are a pretty consistent experience of tear and repair is what I like to call it. Tear it, repair it. Like, I'm hurt and we're repairing it. And the more often we do that, actually it builds that lived experience of people can hurt me and we can get through it and be better at the end of it. So having an experience like that could be an opportunity for growth. The thought that comes to mind for me is that something that happens frequently? Is it something that's ongoing, that needs more in-depth work? Or is it something that it's a moment of pain that can be learned from and grown from? All right. Yeah, and then so I've got one more before we wrap up, and it's the idea that maybe EMDR didn't work because it wasn't the right time or the right therapist, and that's totally true. Not every therapist sticks to the modality. I personally am not certified in EMDR, but I try to stick to the modality pretty precisely because they recommend that. But looking for a therapist who is certified in EMDR, the EMDRIA, EMDRIA, and find a listing of people who are certified in it. They have put in all the time. Or you're right, it might not be the right time for you. So unfortunately, as we're wrapping up, I have to have a hard stop at 7, but I'm just going to do one more. How can I work on my trauma when my partner usually won't respect my boundaries? It's going to be really hard to. Part of working on your trauma is having a supportive environment. So working with your therapist on that is going to be really important, because if your partner is not part of your support system in the sense that they're supporting your boundary setting, then it's going to be really hard, but it's not impossible. So coming up with a plan one-on-one with your therapist would be a great place to start there. And yeah, this was just great. I'm really glad I got to spend this time with you all today, and you've asked some wonderful questions. I wish I could get to all of them, but I know I have a hard stop, and so I'll let Camilla take it away. But thank you so much for letting me be here.
Thank you so much, Kimberly, for this fantastic webinar. And you're just so knowledgeable and your energy is contagious. And this was just absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us and hosting this for us. I just want to say that this webinar is continuing education approved. So you can email me at marriagecommission@usu.edu to request a certificate. And this webinar is recorded, and it will be available a week from today on strongermarriage.org. But I will be personally sending out an email to everyone who registered for this particular webinar with a link to the recorded webinar when it's available. So you'll be the first to know when it's up. And yeah, don't forget to fill out the survey when you log off here. So thank you so much again, Kimberly. Everyone have a great evening. Bye.